Good evening and welcome to the Herb Cain San Francisco Chronicle, sponsored by the Graduate School of Journalism in association with Cal Performances and City Arts and Lectures. I'm the Chancellor of Berkeley campus, Bob Berdahl, and I'm delighted to join you this evening for the conversation with newsman Peter Jennings, hosted by Orville Schell, Dean of our School of Journalism. The Herb Cain San Francisco Chronicle Lecture is now in its fourth year and has, in this very short time, secured a place in Berkeley and in the Bay Area as a premier event, an undertaking that has proven as intellectually stimulating as it is entertaining, which, of course, is exactly what was intended when it was inaugurated in 1996 with Walter Cronkite as the lead guest. The lecture partnership between the Graduate School of Journalism and the San Francisco Chronicle honors the legacy of Chronicle columnist Herb Cain by annually reporting to America on how well our society is communicating. Tonight we are honored to hear from one of America's most respected communicators, a man who brings dignity, intelligence, and a keen worldview to a medium that is not always as dignified or intelligent as some of us might wish. As anchor and senior editor of ABC's World News Tonight, Peter Jennings has for several years been named America's best national TV anchor by the prestigious Washington Journalism Review. And this is particularly impressive for a man who is not a Native American. He is proudly Canadian, as you can tell by how he pronounces the word about. His formal education ended shy of high school graduation. He was too bored, he said, to hang around. And yet his great success as a broadcast newsman, he is the recipient of Emmy Awards for coverage of breaking news as well as for continuing news coverage, and received a Peabody Award in 1996 for his work on the documentary Hiroshima, Why the Bomb Was Dropped, is not at all surprising. Jennings comes by his skill naturally. He is the son of a pioneering broadcaster who has been described as the Edward R. Murrow of Canada. I understand he still keeps his father's old Royal typewriter in his New York office, something fans of the late Herb Cain would certainly appreciate. Now, he told me I should not go through a long biography and litany of his many achievements tonight. He protested that I should simply introduce him and Orville Schell and be done with it. So I'm going to adhere at least a part of that request and to skip some of those many, many achievements which might take longer than we all have. But since 1990, we've watched and learned from his one-hour primetime specials, Peter Jennings Reporting. And those reports we've learned about issues ranging from funding for the arts to the abortion controversy to the horrors of Bosnia and the kind of depth that these issues truly require. And that is also frequently not associated with news reporting. We've also had the pleasure of reading Peter Jennings' work with the publication of his highly regarded and best-selling book, The Century. In it, Jennings and fellow writer Todd Brewster capture the 20th century through the eyes and the words of the people who lived it. As the most senior network news anchor on American television today, Peter Jennings has the capacity and the insight to offer what might be called thick description. And the ABC network, much to its credit, has allowed Jennings to do so. Thus, the ABC News Department has developed some of the finest, most serious current events reporting on television today. It is my great pleasure to welcome to this platform Peter Jennings for a conversation with Dean Orville Schell.
foregoing was a paid political announcement. I asked the Chancellor to go home so that he'd be rested for more serious labors lately. In case you're wondering, can we tell them what we're talking about?
Yes, please.
This is actually an imitation Pakistani rug.
I know you're going to Pakistan soon. I hope we don't get any imitation reporting.
Sorry.
Well,
sorry,
welcome.
I know I have to begin being very deferential.
Welcome to Berkeley, Peter.
Thank
it's
you
really,
very much.
really great.
Molly Ivins sends her best.
She sat in that very chair not so long ago, and it's always a pleasure. I think the quote that I like best from Molly is a description of Ann Edwards, the former governor, and evidently she once said that the higher the hair, the closer to God.
Certainly ethnic.
Yes, indeed. You know, in doing due diligence on you, getting ready for this, I stumbled upon an article in I think it was Maclean's, a Canadian magazine, in which at some point in your career you were quoted as saying that as a youth you were bone lazy and a bit delinquent. And I wonder how did you find yourself?
I don't know the answer to that, but it's true. I was bone lazy. I didn't like school. I think in retrospect I probably didn't have good teachers. And I now realize with a pretty deep interest in education that the value of a good teacher is far greater than anything I ever imagined. But when I was about 21, I guess, as a very young reporter in Ottawa, I discovered the joy of hard work. And not having much of a formal education, I think I was always compensating. Some of my friends will tell you that I still am trying to compensate for the lack of a formal education. I'm over most of the embarrassment, but not all of it. And realize, I spoke at my daughter's graduation from high school last year. She went to college last year. And I stopped in the middle to remind myself and the other parents that my children had now accomplished something that I had never accomplished, which was to graduate from high school. And I couldn't go on. So it clearly clings somewhere in my psyche, the embarrassment. I don't know why I discovered hard work. I love it. I love it.
Do you think the embarrassment that you felt, in some sense, made you want to prove yourself in a manner which made you a better reporter?
I don't think so. I'm not. That's awfully sort of psycho babble. I look upon reporting as I've said this so many times that it's to young people wanting to get into business, and of course I can see none of you, so I have no idea whether you're 20, 30, or 100 out there. Could we turn up the house lights a little bit, maybe? So maybe they're not even here. Oh, thank you. It's very depressing not to be able to see. This is like television. The great thing about television, you never have to look at anybody falling asleep. I, honest to God, looked upon. Clearly, I had my father as a model. My father believed that broadcasting was a public service, and Canada is this enormous place, half again the size of the United States, and the way Canada was knit together was through the national radio system first, and then the national television system. And my first broadcasting jobs, because I always got the prime jobs, were to broadcast to the Eskimos at 3 o'clock in the morning. But it was a public service because the Eskimos were entitled to hear what was going on as we corrupted their lives as vigorously as we white guys did. But it was then the passport to see the world on somebody else's money and to be there in that front row all the time. And I think the longer I've done it, the more I appreciate the fact that we get to write the first draft of history. It's actually the first rough and sometimes very rough draft of history. We get to be in the front row. We get to go places that I'd never have gone if I'd worked. I started working in a bank. I was a teller to start with because I did not having an education. I couldn't get just any job. And in Canada, we had a chartered banking system, so the sons of middle-class people could go and work in banks as tellers, and some of them went on to run the banking system. But I asked another guy if they'd send us to Cuba because that was the way to start off seeing the world, and they wouldn't, so I quit. And I ended up in radio in a place called Prescott, Ontario, which was about as far from Cuba as you could get. But that's why I wanted to go to Cuba. I wanted to see the world.
Didn't you, as a 9-year-old, have a program, Peter's People? What was that?
Peter's program.
Peter's program. And what was that all about?
It was a musical selection program for children. My father was away serving with on a UN mission in Lebanon, and somebody in the children's. We had a children's program division because children were like citizens too in those days, and the children had a right to be heard on the national broadcasting system. It was a disgrace, and so they had this half-hour program, and they said, would I do it? They paid me $25. My father came home from this UN mission, took away the money. The first instincts of what public service really meant, and I did it for about a year. Heard the Teddy Bears Picnic played so many times, and I went on to other things.
You actually became anchor at ABC at a somewhat ill-fated first go-around in the early 60s, did you not?
Yes, but it wasn't as ill-fated as people say it was. I didn't resist. I didn't object to that notion that it was ill-fated for many years. I was young. ABC was trying to attract a youth audience. I had both my teeth in my hair, which is, I thought, fairly common for someone in their middle 20s, but they thought it was positively revolutionary, and so they put me up against Walter Cronkite and Chet Huntley. And we didn't do that badly, and I only have a couple of memories from it. I had to study like mad, because being a Canadian, I had no knowledge of American history to speak of, and one of the very first things I had to do was the inauguration, 1965. And I studied and studied and studied. And I realized, looking back now, how cocky you can be in your middle 20s, because I was doing so well describing this great inauguration parade that at one point I swaggered with my co-anchor person, who was a very interesting woman named Marlene Sanders, who went on to have a good career in public broadcasting, looked to my left and said, "There come the Marines playing Anchors Away." And I then mispronounced the Pomatox. And that was it. So that was one memory. The other memory was that I was at a luncheon one day with Huntley and Cronkite, and somebody in an audience much smaller than this, but somebody who thought television was sort of wasted time anyway, said, "So you guys are just an entertainment." And Huntley took great offense at this and said, "That's not true." He said, "My only concession of entertainment is makeup." He said, "I stop in the makeup department on the way to the studio, and I have put, they take out these terrible bags under my eyes." Some of you are old enough to remember what Chet Huntley looked like. And Cronkite said, "Yes," and Jennings stops in and has them painted on. The rest of it is a total blank, and it's over, it's finished, and I escaped, and I went to the Middle East for the next 7 or 8 years and had a happy life.
Reagan once said that he couldn't imagine a politician who didn't have some acting abilities. And I wonder what role you think acting plays in being an anchor person.
That's believe it or not, Molly Ivins would think that a tough question. I think probably some, but I don't think that anybody who acts on television knowingly succeeds on television. I think there are skills you must have on television, which in part I think, I'm embarrassed to say this, but in part I think have to do a little bit with breeding. If your mother taught you to be well-mannered, and my mother taught me to be well-mannered, then you are probably well-mannered on television. If, on the other hand, you have an instinct to do this, the audience, as politicians have come to discover, will regard the camera as an X-ray machine, and you'll be exposed. So I suppose, and there are mannerisms that people pick up on television, and they become either, sort of an indelible part of their persona, but if they're deemed in any way, shape, or form to be false, they become, I think, contribute to people's downfall. So I assume that part of what I do every day has a kind of acting part of it, I guess, is the best I can think. But I'm not conscious of it. I hope.
And yet I think that there are a fair number of perhaps not anchors, but people in magazine shows who really aren't very much involved in getting the story. They come in late, they're told what to ask, and they do it very well. They do seamless productions. And, in last analysis, if you're in there where the cement is getting mixed, you have to acknowledge that it is a form of acting rather than news gathering.
Well, you're beginning to tread into very dangerous territory for a broadcast journalist who realizes this is being recorded for later broadcast. I always tell people, we get two choices. I'll either be honest with you and we won't record it, or I'll pull my punches and lie. It's like Stuart Udall always used to say at the end of a speech, you've heard what I had to say. Now you know what's on my mind. If you don't like it, I'll change it. But the answer is that magazine journalism in America is obliged, the Dateline, 2020, Primetime Live, all those, are now in the most unenviable position in all of journalism, I think, in that they are forced, ever since television discovered that we could make money with news and information, are forced to compete with ER or Chicago Hope or whatever it is. And thus they're required to get ratings in prime time which are equivalent to, and sometimes supersede, because entertainment is often so bad, supersede the entertainment programs they're competing against. And then, to a large extent, they have either been forced to or too willingly done the kind of journalism which places far greater emphasis on performance and persona and celebrity and all that stuff, I think, than otherwise they would have to. So yes, it is true, there are people, there are correspondents working for magazine shows in the country who do very little work and whose mistakes are never seen, and for whom producers do a large measure of the preparation. My wife is a magazine show producer from a very serious background, and I think for her generation it's very distressing that magazine shows have gone the direction they've gone. I hope that's delicately put, because I have to work with a lot of these people.
Delicately put, but let me push you a little. I mean, it strikes me that it must be very difficult for someone such as yourself, who really does have opinions and in private can share them, to constantly have to sort of amputate what you say in public.
Oh, no, quite the contrary. There are two things I never want to do on television, and there's one thing I never want to do on television, and I've done it once, and that's cry. I was raised in a tradition in which I was raised, I suppose, in what you'd call the British tradition of newscasting, which was you were essentially a purveyor of information. You were, in essence, the gatekeeper on a conveyor belt of other people's opinions and other people's reportage. In the British Broadcasting Corporation, up until very recently, some of you may know, and in the Canadian system up until recently, the people who were anchor people were newsreaders. Only in Canada now are they getting the first generation of anchor people who actually came out of, were reporters first. In America, we've had that tradition to a much longer period of time. BBC still has, the British Broadcasting Corporation still has newsreaders. They used to actually wear dinner jackets on New Year's Eve and Easter to just sort of prove how silly, in many respects, the system was. But I was brought up in a tradition where the most important thing I could do every day in a daily newscast was to convey the news of the day, and I mean that in a quite sort of lofty sense as it sounds. And that so I have no problems restraining myself on the air.
But how about in occasions where you're not on the air, but where, I mean, you obviously have sentiments which you feel are difficult to express because of your employer, because of the politesse of a situation.
Oh, and I'm also a wildly emotional and often irrational human being, as all my friends will tell you. I'm wildly emotional and sort of periodically even radical. But I have no trouble restraining myself on the air, because I think it's not fair, or I guess not called for, to be really pompous about it, to try to somehow force my emotions about a situation on other people. Now, you have to understand, and I hope most of you do, that my thoughts about the world and issues and the ones I'm interested in play an enormous role in what I do before I go on the air. So in some respects, I've waged my ideological, journalistic battles long before I've gone on television. I'm not sure I'm not taking this too far, but a young woman in one of the journalism classes said, well, what do you do every day? And I said, I'm aware that there are a lot of people in the country who think we show up at 6:30, put on tie and makeup, and just read the news and go home. So I explained to her very quickly, which maybe it's helpful if I explain here. I'm an editor. And so I spend most of my day editing other people's copy and telling other people to go and cover certain stories, even telling them sometimes how I think it should be covered, because I'm a senior editor. And with rank goes privilege. Quite often I'm working on my own projects, so I may be writing, I may be reporting, which means going and doing what reporters do, talking to other people. I may be attempting analysis, which means I have to go and talk to historians and psychologists, but it depends what I'm doing. And then about 3 o'clock every day I become a rewrite man. Anybody over 50 or 60 here will know what a rewrite man was. You pull up your sleeves and you begin to rewrite what other people do. And I rewrite or write everything that goes on the evening news, either for style, but very often for fact. It's a good way for me to indulge in an editor's process. And then from 6:30 to 7, if I do it right the first time, I'm a news reader. I just sit there and read it. And if I screw it up, we do it again. For California, we always do everything again. We all want California always to have the best version. And on Monday nights, at Monday Night Football, I then, when Monday Night Football makes our life miserable, I sit there and say, good evening and welcome to the North Pacific. And I do it all over again, so we impress the people in Seattle. So I do a lot of different things every day. But I have no trouble keeping my opinions. I hope I have no trouble keeping, I don't feel like I have any trouble keeping my opinions dormant while actually on the air.
What is your conception of what journalism should do? What role should it play in our democratic society? And how do you imagine yourself as a sort of catalyzing agent in this process? And finally, are we doing it well?
You know, this is one of those questions that plays into the anchorman's sense of his own grandeur. And I'm terrified of even beginning to answer. Because, you know, most journalists I know, and there's several in this room who I've admired for a long time, worked with on occasion, and I'm even self-conscious there in the room listening to me. A couple in particular, and they know who they are. In fact, they're saying, yeah, it's me he's talking about. I'm the really serious one who he envies. And they're probably right. But I think that most journalists don't think a lot about what we do. I don't think a lot about what we do because I'm too busy worrying about East Germany and whether or not we're really going to bomb the Koreans or why we're giving all this grain to the Koreans and whatever it is about the Koreans.
And yet, Peter, I have to say, I think, and you yourself, I spent the day with you now and we talked a lot. I mean, I think we all feel that something is really wrong. I mean, yes, you're busy every day, but within that busyness, do you feel we're doing a good job? I mean, in doing whatever.
Some of us are doing a very good job. Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the beginning. I think we're blessed in America. Let's say all the obvious cliches. I think we're blessed in America because no nation on earth, actually no big nation on earth, has as much access to as much data and information. Our great challenge today with so much of it is trying to figure out what to believe, what not to believe, who to trust, who not to trust. And I think as news consumers, we all have that. I think some of us do that quite well. I said to somebody earlier today, Joan Beater, who runs the television department in your school, who was my secretary 30 years ago. That was the other thing about being 26 in the Anchorman. You had a secretary, and she had nice legs. It was terrific, you know. But it was a 26-year-old thinking, I'm much older than that now. But I said to her today, we do the evening news much better today than we ever did before. The technology enables us to tell complicated stories in a more comprehensive fashion. We have more specialists available to us on television. We have a more literate television community on which to call. People like, I don't want to flatter you more than once.
Go ahead.
People like yourself included, who've understood that it's important for scholars to know how to communicate, as you have so often on television about China. So we have tremendous resources. I think the evening news today on a Sirius network, it can be really at its best, very serious, good broadcast. I think as a community we're confused.
But isn't the key word there can be? I mean, I'm having a little trouble here, Peter, because I sense that you're being a little elusive about, whatever the problem is, if there is one. I mean, all is not well in the world of the media. I mean,
what do you think's wrong?
Let me read you a quote here and get you to react to it. Well, I'm supposed to be interviewing you here.
Yes, but I know you, Orville. You'll answer the question anyway, so...
Well, I'm trying not to. I want to read you
He knows, you see, that I'm talking to Molly Ivins. He is so on his best behavior now because of the hit that Molly Ivins gave him.
Now, you saw that wonderful movie, Network. And in it, you remember Howard
Yes,
Beale?
very well.
I mean, he screams out, he says, TV is a goddamn amusement park. It's an illusion. You'll never get any truth from us. It's madness. So turn off your TV sets. Turn them off right now. Is that good advice?
Of course it isn't, but I got to tell you, there has never been an anchor person. Listen, I'm beginning to get into the twilight zone here. I'm hoping it's a fairly extended zone. But at some point, I'm going to stop doing what I'm doing. Everybody like me thinks, do you know how I'm going to end my career? I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. Good night. That's my great memory. And you know, people live in fear that I'm going to say that. People in control rooms around ABC, they all live in fear that sooner, one of these days, that someone like me, is probably more likely to be Dan, are going to snap.
All right. Well, now we're on a good line of thought here. Let's follow this out. If you snapped, what would happen? What would you say?
Well, first of all, I do think let's get the Beale quote about how shallow we are out of the way, because I don't believe we are. I think we do shallow things, and I think we approach some subjects in a shallow way, and we miss an awful lot. And we are, and this is what I've enjoyed most today, talking about the confusion in the media, because I think it's the confusion in America. I think we're confused about what's important. I've just been talking to a friend of mine named Mark Dowie, who I haven't seen in many years, a great reporter and editor of Mother Jones for many years. I was telling Deirdre English that we've stolen more stuff from Mother Jones in our career than from a lot of other magazines in the country. But Mark is in the process of finishing a book on foundations in America. What he says is the first non-political history of foundations in America. Now, this strikes me, and I think he's here somewhere, but I don't mean to, actually I do mean to embarrass him. If you're going to get credit, you might as well be embarrassed along the way.
Would he like to stand?
But here is a subject which is like opening an onion about American society, it seems to me, that we don't do. So I immediately said to him, please, would you send me the galleys, because I'll steal outrageously from him if I think it's good. There's so much to be done about this changing society. There's so much to be done about America's changing relationship in the world. We don't do a lot of it. But it's mostly, I think, because we're a bit like the society. We're uncertain about what's important. And we also, as a lot of we professional journalists have agreed today, we do what we know.
But come now, Peter, I think you know what's important, and I think if you were conceiving of the perfect network or the perfect news program, you'd know exactly what to do.
Indeed, I would love to do a magazine show. I would love.
Well, tell us about it. What would it be
35 years ago, I worked on a magazine program in Canada called This Hour Has 7 Days. First of all, it was the grandfather of all these titles, 20, 60 minutes. This Hour Has 7 Days. And it was fabulous. And it had no rules. And being that it was for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, it didn't have to get an audience. And so, it's like working for PBS.
And did it get an audience?
It did what the instinct of the people who worked on the broadcast thought it should do. So some days it would do satire, and some days it would do a whole hour on something, and some would do live, and it's as fresh today as it was 35 years ago. And I would love to do a magazine program like that, and ABC wouldn't let me do that in a month of Sundays.
Why?
Because they don't think it would succeed.
Succeed in being interesting and provocative, or succeed in making money?
Succeed in succeeding in a mass market environment. The implication of which is perhaps not necessarily making money, but at least sustaining itself. Now, one of the good things, we talked a little bit about this today, some of us, one of the good things about the fracturing of the television universe, I think for all of us in the country, but especially for professional broadcasters, is that as we fracture, as we increasingly all become niche broadcasters, as the J School broadcasting component at Berkeley finds a place, I mean this quite seriously, finds a place in the wider television universe, it'll be more possible for us to do that, because we'll end up broadcasting to more limited audience. But now it's very difficult. You all see the magazine shows. You know what they do week after week after week. That's because they have to compete with the entertainment programs. And the kind of magazine show I'd love to do, I suppose it sounds a bit elitist, I just don't think would succeed. And they are convinced it wouldn't succeed.
Well, the marketplace is indeed a wondrous thing sometimes, and it does create enormous dynamism. But would you be in favor of the regulators saying, all right, we're not just going to have 1 or 2 hours of kids programming on Saturday, but we're going to decree that 2 hours every night of every network in prime time are going to go to serious programming with no advertising?
You've been smoking something.
Well, I'm not saying it's going to happen.
I keep forgetting, university, you're allowed to spend your life with hypotheticals. Right?
Well, I'm just saying that actually the airwaves are public.
I tell my bosses that all the time.
I mean, if ABC didn't want to do the program, I wager somebody else would.
Well, again, it was a great pleasure to be here today and find how many of the about-to-emerge generation are interested in documentary films. Because as someone who loves documentaries and who does at least 7 documentaries on television every year, only because it's in my contract, I'm utterly convinced I would not be doing them did I not have what is perceived to be anchorman clout in order to keep them in my contract. But I was very encouraged to see that there's a whole generation here, apparently, which is encouraged and wanting to do documentaries because they think they'll find a place for them in this new marketplace.
I'm not sure they think they'll find a place. I think they hope they'll find a place. But that's a real question. I mean, as Dean...
No, I'm inclined to think that they will find a place now. They'll be done more cheaply.
Yeah.
They'll be done with far less of the cushion and support system that we've had at the networks. They may have to photograph them themselves in many cases. However they're done, I beg your pardon, I think they'll be done more cheaply. And therefore they may not always be as polished. But I think there's a hunger for, dare I say it, product out there in many new places that there weren't before. And listen, there's 70 channels.
But this sounds a bit like the death knell of the networks that you're describing.
Well, I think it was very provocatively put. When I first came to the evening news, somebody said they'll be dead in 5 years. Somebody said they'll be dead in 10 years.
I heard Morley say for yesterday, say it again, 5 years.
Yeah, that's because Morley works on 60 Minutes. But the answer is, I think if the evening news programs continue to find a place for themselves in terms of content, there will continue to be a place for them. There's always talk, will one network drop it? And what would the network to drop the evening news be? The current running is at CBS, ironically, would be the one that would drop it. Because there seems to be a far greater drive at CBS for profit and synergy and all that stuff than there is perhaps at ABC. But I see no reason why they may not exist in the same hour of the day. They may be moved around all over the dial. In Washington, you can see the evening news at 7 o'clock in the evening, or you can see it at 10 o'clock on a smaller station. So I think there's a real urge and the drive in the networks to understand how we make the product. I would have never used the word product 10 years ago, but it's go with the times. To move it around in ways that it's more accessible. Broadband television and computing broadcasting, things I don't yet understand, are going to change television dramatically, I think, very quickly. It doesn't automatically mean that the evening bulletin, if you will, or an evening bulletin suddenly disappears.
You know, I wonder, it seems to me that in my lifetime and your lifetime, the esteem that society has had for journalists has also eroded. And I wonder if you think that's true, and to what you attribute that.
Well, if you look back at some of the histories of the Civil War, you'll see that journalists were not always held in high regard by the generals of the day. And we are, I think, regarded as an odious commodity by some institutions in government, not least of which is the Pentagon. In fact, foremost of which I think is probably the Pentagon. But again, I'm not a student of this, but I tend to think it's cyclical.
You don't
I think we're still ahead of lawyers.
Well, that's
not
makes
much.
me feel better.
I think it rises and falls. I mean, I think that I think I try not to answer this question as a consumer of news. As a consumer of news, I hate a lot of what I see, and yet I watch it on occasion, and I feel that I need it. And in times, I'm always interested how our ratings go up in times of crisis. And it suggests to me that in times of crisis there is still a role for, responsible, middle-of-the-road establishment journalism. I think some of what we've done and some of our imperiousness, some of our Watergate attitude, some of our post-Watergate, some of our gotcha journalism that we practice, some of the sort of broad assaults we've mounted on the political class have brought us into disfavor, deservedly. But I do think it's cyclical. Next year, I think the public may think better of us. I hope.
But you make it sound it's almost like weather. I mean, that it doesn't have anything to do with anything that we're doing or society is doing or that the media
I thought I'd said that in fact, some of we do bring on ourselves.
But do you think we as journalists are bringing it on, or do you think the institutions that we're working in tend to have a responsibility in this.
That makes the journalist this poor hapless tool of the institution for which he works. I can't answer that. I mean, I think people are very suspicious of the fact that more and more journalism is being held in fewer and fewer hands. And I think as practicing journalists, we're somewhat worried about that too. Will Disney affect my life? I told somebody today that every time Disney does something bad, I try to do a story about it. Because I think it's good for me, good for Disney, good for ABC News, even though we're owned by Disney. And I think they understand the fact that we have this separate life. On the other hand, they do control the purse strings. And Rupert Murdoch controls the purse string, and now Mel Karmazin controls the purse strings at CBS. I don't know what their first call in life is, but as long as somebody controls the purse strings, then they have an enormous, unbelievable amount of influence on what we do. But I don't think that excuses us as a sort of class of apparatchiks from having committed some pretty overt sins in the last couple of decades.
But nonetheless, I must say...
Getting very serious, this.
Well, let me lighten it up a bit. The question I wanted to ask you all day, I heard from a friend that at one point you had a giant inflatable statue of Mickey Mouse in your hallway, and your children used to dress it up in your clothes. Is this true?
That's true. But it wasn't inflatable, it was stuffed. And it was sent to me shortly... Actually, this is, I suppose, the one major intrusion by Disney in my life. Shortly after Disney bought the company, they sent somebody, I think it was Michael Eisner, sent several of the members of the staff, clearly the anchor people because we were the most important people to know, enormous Mickey Mouses, Mickey Mice, or whatever you call them, these enormous things. They were as big as I was. By the way, one thing you do not do with my company, you do not make jokes about Mickey Mouse. I learned that very quickly. Some of my colleagues didn't. But they sent this enormous thing in an enormous box. And it wouldn't go through the security machine at ABC, so my assistant sent it back. So here's Michael Eisner thinking he's making this wonderful gesture to his new staff, and somebody sent Mickey Mouse back. Ultimately, he arrived, and he got unpacked, and I didn't know what to do with him. But he was big. He was bigger than the two of us. So indeed, I took him, I put him in the front hall of my apartment, and so that my children could dress him in different clothes every day. And he looked quite nice. Some days he'd be a country gentleman. Some days he'd be a hippie. Some days he was protesting for a free Tibet. I mean, it was just... it was wonderful. Yes, I finally gave him away.
What stories...
Someone in greater need of a prop.
What stories have you really enjoyed doing and you found inspiring?
The two happiest periods in my life were my first 2 years in America covering the South in the 60s. Which, as I said to the Chancellor walking over this evening, I had never been so frightened in my life. I think I've covered 7 wars since then, and I was never so frightened as I was in the American South in the mid-1960s. But it was an astonishingly invigorating story, the struggle for civil rights, and ironically, it endeared me to the South. So when I went away for almost 20 years as a foreign correspondent, and I came back to America, the very first place I wanted to go was back to Mississippi and Alabama to see what had changed. And the happiest 7 years of my life, as one class heard today, was living in the Middle East. And I was very lucky. I tell you, I have no idea whether they're still awake, but I had been living in Rome. My first overseas assignment was in Rome, and I had to cover North Africa and running out of the Middle East. And they wanted to open a news bureau in the Arab world, and nobody had been interested until me. So we were going to open it in Lebanon. And I went to Lebanon, and they sort of thought they'd had to talk me into going to Lebanon. I'd really wanted to go, but I dragged my feet, so they thought, oh my God, the poor guy has to leave Rome. Lebanon was much more fun than Rome in the 70s. But I convinced them that I should own everything east of the Mediterranean. And I sent them a map with circles on it showing it took from Beirut an hour you could drive to Damascus. Those days took 45 minutes to fly to Cairo, an hour and a half to drive to Damascus, 2 hours to Tehran, and like 5.5 hours to India. So I owned everything. And it was wonderful. I owned everything out as far as India, and Hong Kong got the rest. Except on the very first day I was in Beirut, which is the other story I hope isn't boring, I was walking by a coffee shop, and 2 correspondents who later became great friends, a man named John Bullock, who worked for the Telegraph, English newspaper, and a man named John Cooley, who then worked for the Christian Science Monitor as one of America's great Middle East correspondents, said to me, have you told your office about the crisis in Cyprus? I just got off the plane. I said, what crisis in Cyprus? Don't worry about that. Tell your office it's a crisis in Cyprus and you've got to go immediately. I said, but what's the crisis? They said, don't worry, we'll tell you briefly in a moment. And you know how it is. You feel, boy, I'll tell my office it's a crisis in Cyprus, and they won't ask, so I don't have to know. It's amazing how our minds work, isn't it? To think that you actually rely on us on occasion. So I went to the phone, I called New York, and I said, listen, I just got a really hot tip. There's a serious crisis on Cyprus. They said, you should go. So I went back to the table. I said, what's the crisis on Cyprus? Oh, don't worry about that. He said, but now you have Cyprus and not the guy in Tel Aviv.
This is sort of colonialism.
And Cyprus is this wonderful little island, which was just a real, it's been part of the Cold War. Still the Greeks and Turks may go to war over it. And it was absolutely equidistant between the Tel Aviv Bureau and the Beirut Bureau. And our guy in Tel Aviv wasn't smart enough to tell him there was a crisis in Cyprus. For the entire 7 years, I used to go to Cyprus on vacation, go for weekends. Guy in Tel Aviv hated me. But that was the happiest time of my life. The sad part about being an anchor person is that you are no longer a reporter. I was talking to the Chancellor coming over, who, as all of you know, is a German historian. And I asked him, I said, what do you miss? He said he missed teaching, and he missed not being able to stay current. Covering the Middle East was like taking coke. I did it 24 hours a day, nothing but the Middle East for 6 years. You just talk Arabs and Israelis, Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, who's doing what to whom. I used to know the ins and outs of the Ba'ath Party before Saddam Hussein knew the ins and outs of the Ba'ath Party. And it was just fascinating. And I was a specialist for the first and only time in my life. I see Mark Danner here, who's one of your professors. Is that you, Mark? Yeah, and a great writer. He and I've been in a few places in the world, and he's been a specialist, so he knows what I'm talking about. There's an unbelievable joy as a journalist as being a specialist in something and knowing more than the other guys. And I went for a long, lengthy period of time, which I knew at least as much as a lot of my colleagues, and it was very exciting.
As we were walking over here, Peter, you also asked the Chancellor why would he have wanted to become Chancellor when he could teach, and then you raised the point yourself. It's a little bit like the wager between anchorman and journalist or correspondent. And as I listened to you talk, you talk with great animation about this time in the field. So let me ask you.
It's the money.
I can't let you get away with such a simple answer. No, but what for you?
My wife made me do it. It's true. It's true. I was living in London. We had 3 anchor people a day. I had a very smart boss. He's just retired and become the chairman, named Rune Arledge, who transformed much of television. First sports. He's the creator of Wide World of Sports and Instant Replay and all that stuff. And then he came to the news division, and he gave us, infused us with great energy and money, which was important for a news division. We had been something of a doormat in the competition at the time. And he knew that we had no one at ABC News who could compete with Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley. And so he had this very smart idea. Instead of having a star, he would try to diffuse the whole star system. So he created a 3-anchor system in which we had a guy in Chicago named Matt Roberts, who's sadly dead. We had a guy in Washington named Frank Reynolds, who's a wonderful journalist, who's now sadly dead, and me in London. And I had then achieved everything I wanted to achieve in life, which was to become the chief foreign correspondent. It's all I wanted to do in life. I had a wonderful life. I never even had to have a raincoat in England, because if it rained, I was in Africa. It was just fabulous. I had a wonderful, wonderful life. It was all through the 70s and the early part of the 80s. I was at every major story in the world. And then Frank Reynolds got sick and died, and they asked would I come home and do it. And my wife at the time, a very smart journalist and author, said, if they offer you the brass ring once like this and you turn it down, they'll never offer it to you again. So I said, okay.
But it's a brass ring, not a gold ring?
It's burnished brass. And that's how I did it. If I'd known what I was getting into, I almost think I wouldn't have done it.
Well, tell us about what you got into. What are the pluses and the minuses?
Well, the pluses are I really like being an editor, and if you're a if you're a good anchor person, you're a good editor, and you're a good producer, and I like the power. I really do. I really like coming back. I will come back from this trip to my office with, I think, if I were to count them quickly, 6 story ideas which I've gathered here in the last 36 hours. I had a wonderful breakfast, thanks to Orville, down in Silicon Valley today, in which I realized that we've been covering the technology of the technology, but we haven't been covering the sort of psychological dimension of it very well. So of the valley. Some woman said to me this morning, I apologize for the digression, she said, you're very comfortable talking about India and Pakistan, but you get tight when you talk about us, as if we're a different culture. And she was right. And I learned, that was one of my great revelation of the day, was that from the East, I realized the sort of Silicon Valley defensiveness against an Eastern reporter, particularly. But it was a great lesson for me, and I'll go home with a whole series of stories you might do about the sort of mindset here. So I love having the power to be able to put things on the agenda. Mark Danner, who I was talking about a moment ago, has done some fabulous work on the former Yugoslavia. We went to Bosnia together. I went to Bosnia the first time because I couldn't get other reporters to go to Bosnia. The winter of 95, 3-5, I guess. What? 4, thank you. We went in 4, so it was 93 I went. First winter I went was 93. 94 was the Marketplace Massacre, in which he was much braver than I was, as he reminded me last night. But I couldn't get anybody to go, and so I thought, well, maybe the anchorman should go just to sort of show off, and maybe he'll set an example. And I was able to put Bosnia on the agenda, not much humility at work here in my shop, and keep it on the agenda. And we did Bosnia, 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 Bosnia. I was largely trying to impress my children with some, that I had a social conscience, and I would never have to look back in 20 years and say, I missed this, ignore this massacre that was going on. That was a tremendous feeling of power. I don't know what to say about the money. If I'd known about the, quote, celebrity, as good a time as I'm having at the moment, and I'm very flattered so many people are here, I think my friends would say this is something of an unnatural state of affairs for me. And it's a difficult and awkward part of one's life to manage the fact that you're in people's kitchens and sitting rooms and bedrooms. Have you any idea how difficult it is to handle a middle-aged woman who says you're in my bedroom every night? So that's in some respects the downside. But the public has always been wonderfully kind. People who really think you're a creep tend to say it behind your back and out of hearing. So most people are very nice. But you're also become a spear carrier for the network. So I do promotion. Don't forget, coming up on 2020, rape and pillage. My father would roll over in his grave if he knew I was doing that kind of thing. That's the downside of that, having to be a journalist and a promoter. But I now have a role in hiring the next generation of journalists at ABC, which is very exciting. So that kind of power that comes with being at the head office, I think we all probably have experienced that no matter what we do in life. Being at the head office for part of your life is better than spending your entire life in the boonies, as interesting as the boonies are. But I miss it, sure.
Do you think that the media, and perhaps politicians as well, in their fixation on polling or focus groups, are abdicating a kind of leadership? Because after all, we might well turn to the media to learn new things, to be introduced to things that we didn't already know, to become involved in issues that are important and that escaped our attention. Whereas if you're constantly focusing on what people seem to want, just as politicians are kind of babbling back much of what they think people want to hear, we, in a sense, have the leadership function being compromised.
I think it must go with being the dean that you presume the worst in us.
Well, I'm just probing around here, Peter.
We don't do a lot of focus groups. I've never been. To the best of my knowledge on World News Tonight, we've done one focus group.
Well, the Nielsen rating is the focus group.
Well, the Nielsen rating is like a report card you get in high school every Tuesday. You go and look at all the ratings here. They come out every Tuesday morning. And as I said to somebody today, I loved it when we were in second place. It's hard when you're in first place because you're looking over your shoulder. It's crummy to be in third place. And if there had been a fourth place, we'd have been at fourth at some time. But you get over that pretty quickly.
But do you think the executives upstairs for whom the Nielsen ratings raise the price of a commercial get over it?
Yeah, no, but I think it's part of their management role to be concerned about it and manage that dimension of our lives. That's not part of something that I have to do. Polling is another matter. I don't know quite how you mean polling. I think one of the sins we commit in journalism is we we use polls sometimes as substitutes for reporting. And we have a very good polling unit at ABC, but they're sometimes polling on subjects. I say, why are we doing that? Or why are we asking this question this week? Why do we ask that 500 people there? Why don't we just go out and report on them? And so I think there's a danger that polls have become substitute process for our own reporting. But we don't spend an awful lot of time on focus groups, which is why we're so confused. I mean, there's so much. One of the things that occurred to me at the end of today, having talked to several people in architecture, is that we should put design on the evening news. Why shouldn't we put design on the evening news? We live with design. The design of this theater, the battle that's going on in downtown Berkeley about what you're going to do about leftover spaces. Are you going to expand or contract, or why does it cost $1,000 to rent a single room, which I learned tonight in that's a sort of design issue potential for me. Why do so many middle American cities have to have their gorgeous Fortune 500 buildings? We don't put design on the evening news. I don't know yet why we don't. And that's quite frankly how I'd like to spend my time, rather than worrying about focus groups and what people think of us.
What public figures have you had occasion recently to interview or to report on that have really inspired you?
Real or fictional, as a la Morris?
Let's say real. I mean, do you have any heroes
no.
that are still alive?
Oh God, no. This is a very embarrassing thing to talk about in front of an American audience. I have no heroes. Some woman at the J School I was talking tonight is doing a whole program on heroes. She looked at me in what I thought was an animated fashion. She had said, "We've been using a century series to talk as sort of basis to this, and who are your heroes?" I said, "I don't have any, because I grew up in a British society, or an Anglo-Saxon British society, in which Canadians hate heroes. It's just not Canadian to have heroes. Canada's now celebrating the end of the millennium too, and they're desperately trying to put together a book that's thicker than that about heroes. We had the Victoria Cross, which was the equivalent of the Congressional Medal. My only hero in my whole life was my father.
And why was he a hero?
Because he had taste and judgment. He believed in fairness and public service. And he convinced me, after I'd sort of lollygagged around for a while, that it didn't matter whether I worked for commercial television or public television, it was a reasonably decent calling. So if at the end of when I fall off the cliff at ABC and somebody's obliged to write some nice epitaph about my time there, I think the thing they will say about me is he's a desperately unnecessarily hard taskmaster, which I am, a very tough employer. But I think they'll say I was fair. And then I will think, thank you, then I've satisfied the one hero in my life who was my father. But it's very embarrassing to be in a group of hero-praising Americans, and we are crazy for heroism in this country. Ronald Reagan used to, up on the balcony there, at his, remember at the State of the Union addresses? He'd have heroes, and I always felt very uncomfortable about it with it, because I always thought the heroes were uncomfortable. Remember that wonderful kid who saved all the lives when the plane crashed in Washington on the snowy night, not too long before the inaugural speech? Larry something was his name. And Ronald Reagan made him stand up on the balcony. I think the poor kid had no idea what he was getting into, because we kept him as a hero for 6 months, and then we chewed him up and spit him out and went looking for another hero. So I'm anti-hero.
Well,
I hope the tape burns.
Who have you found yourself intrigued with, esteemed, that you have come in contact with?
Oh, lots of people. I was totally intrigued by Margaret Thatcher, because no matter what I asked her, she paid no attention. I once went on a reporting trip after the Indo-Pak. I don't know why I've been talking a lot about India. I'm about to go back to India and Pakistan to try to do an hour on Kashmir.
It must be this rug.
Yes,
This radiating
carpet, this cheap imitation Caucasian. But I once went off to interview Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who was the first leader of an independent Bangladesh, and Mrs. Gandhi, and then Prime Minister Bhutto of Pakistan. And somebody said, it's just going to be so easy. He's going to cry, Sheikh Mujib, which he did. Mrs. Gandhi is going to lie, which she did, incorrigibly, and Mr. Bhutto, the then Prime Minister of Pakistan, was just going to run circles around me because he'd been the president of the Oxford Debating Society. And he did. He just blew my mind. And public figures are. We all just are totally intrigued by somebody. I was telling somebody about Anwar Sadat. I'll tell you a story I've never told before. I sort of trained Anwar Sadat in television. I say this sort of ambiguously, because I made a film about his life long before he was discovered by Barbara Walters or Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite once told me that he'd been on a cruise with Sadat somewhere in Europe. They'd been doing an interview on the back of a ship, and Cronkite said, "Well, thank you, Mr. President. Now, if we could just turn the camera." He said, "Oh, I know Peter Jennings told me all about the cutaways." You know, I turned around the camera and nodded knowingly, right? But Anwar Sadat's wife, who had been raised in Lincolnshire in England, had a slightly dotty mother. She was a bit loose. And they tried, and she lived with the Sadats in Egypt, but they always tried to keep her under wraps. And I got so familiar with the Sadats, I practically lived in their household for about 6 months, and I was deemed a fairly trustworthy fellow. And one morning I arrived early at their estate just outside Alexandria to do a series of interviews with him. And he was still upstairs trying on. He's an absolute clothes horse. He would never appear on television unless he tried on 4 or 5 different things. And we used to get his leftover ties. It was really exciting. And the dotty mother was wandering around the grounds. And I was very polite to her. "Good morning, you know, how do you do, how do you do?" And then he came down from the and I said, "I just had this long, wonderful conversation with your mother-in-law." And he just totally lost it. This is a man who invaded, drove the Israelis off the Suez Canal. And he was totally frozen by the notion that I had a conversation with his mother-in-law. It's one of the most powerful moments I ever had.
What's the most stinging rebuke you've ever received as a journalist or anchor person?
Oh, that's a good question.
Painful rebuke.
I'll tell you a really painful experience, which is probably more serious than you're looking for. The Chancellor mentioned that I'd done this program on the decision to drop the atomic bomb. It was in the 50th anniversary of the year that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and a very, very smart producer from Washington, Sherry Jones, came to me and said, "What we should do is a program which is neutral, but it's all about the decision, not about the efficacy of dropping the bomb, but the decision to drop the bomb." And some of you may recall it was at the time when the Air Force Association was having a fight with the Smithsonian Institution about the display of the Enola Gay, and the Smithsonian, which has now caved on a whole lot of other issues ever since, was trying to take a sort of neutral position on the decision to drop the bomb. So we're proceeding along with this program, and part of our interest, I went to do the stand-ups. That's where you stand in front of the camera, do your little pieces to camera at the Smithsonian, and I said quite idly some words to the effect that the Smithsonian had taken a position which was not actually accurate in historical terms. And Rush Limbaugh got word of this and decided that he would, who's a wonderfully entertaining character, provided you think of him as an entertainer, and he sort of whopped up the audience against me, the foreign devil. It's one of those times it didn't pay to be a Canadian. The foreign devil, that I was going to call into question the efficacy of having dropped the bomb to end the war in Japan and save all these American lives in the Pacific. And I had more letters on the subject than I've ever had on any single subject ever before. I had almost 20,000 letters from people who'd never seen the program or saw half the program, who just hated me so because they thought I had said something. Of course, I hadn't said that at all. Hadn't even addressed the subject. And a lot of them sent me bus money to go back to Canada. They clearly thought I had plebeian tastes, but it was very painful. It was very, very. I mean, you get used to being attacked. That's not true. You never get used to being attacked, but you get attacked. But that was one of the most painful experiences for me, because I wanted to reach out to everyone. I call people who write me really crappy, shitty letters. I call them up on the telephone. I never call anybody who compliments me. I call up the really angry. "Hello, Mr. Jones? Hi, it's Peter Jennings. Don't chat with me, fella." I said, "Oh, no, Mr. Jones, it's really me. And that letter you wrote, you were really angry. It's wonderful. I mean, how else do you learn if you don't talk to the angry people?" But I could never call up all, as I wanted to, one after the other, all those 20,000 guys, many of them veterans, to say, I didn't say that. And I never quite. I mean, that's one of the really, truly painful experiences. Which means I've had it easy so far.
Why don't we take some questions from the audience? And I think here they come.
Oh, God. Writers.
I don't know what.
Yes, I do know, Donnie.
Hand-knotted woolen carpets, 100% wool pile made in Pakistan. It's not fake. All right?
Now, see, there's a really good correction. A member of the Pakistani carpet industry says this is not a fake. This is a Pakistani carpet.
Well, here's one. Do you ever wish that you could be an anonymous journalist? If so, what story would you want to cover? If you could.
The question of anonymity is a problem for anchor people, because, you know, it cuts, it's like so much of what we do in life, it cuts both ways. People want to talk to me, believe it or not. And I love to talk to people. My former wife used to complain she could never get past a street corner. Great story for me is America. And it's, I regret a little that you can't just go anywhere in the country now that somebody doesn't know who you are.
A little or a lot?
Well, a lot sometimes. Surprisingly little sometimes. I have a friend who lives in Turkey. This is a digression, but I'll tell you a story about celebrity. He's a friend who lives in Turkey in a place called Bodrum. Some of you may know it's on the southern Turkish coast. It's quite a hot watering hole. And he was a record producer, and among his clients was Mick Jagger. Mick Jagger was complaining to him one day. I think this applies to all celebrities. Mick Jagger said, "I can't go anywhere. They tear the clothes off me. Nobody ever leaves me alone. I can't live a normal life. I can't be who I am." This guy said, "You should come to this place called Bodrum in Turkey. Nobody will know who you are." The guy said, "Oh, no." He said, "Come." So Mick Jagger showed up in Bodrum to stay with this friend of mine. The first day, my friend did what he does every Friday, every day at 5 o'clock. He went down to get the mail. I said to Jagger, "You want to come?" "No, they'll tear me apart." He said, No. They won't pay any attention to you." Jagger finally talked Jagger into going with him. Jagger dressed up, big black hat, scarf on his face, dark glasses, baggy trousers. Came back. Nobody knew who he was. Next day they went through the same thing. Jagger wore just a little less. Nobody knew who he was. By the fourth day, Jagger went down looking like himself. Nobody knew who the hell he was. He's the stupidest place I've ever been in my life. I don't know why I'm reminded of that, but it's the sort of the two sides of celebrity, I suppose.
Have you ever had to cover a story that compromised your morals, beliefs? If so, how did you deal with it?
Never. It's an easy one. I mean, it's an easy one for me. You always worry about it. You always, I think any journalist worries about how he or she is going to have to trim their sails and under what circumstances. I've never had to do it. In this respect, I work for a wonderful news organization. They've never, ever asked me to do things which they knew were beyond my own moral parameters. Never. Never even suggested it. Easy answer. Yet.
Who have been your teachers, and maybe more interesting, your most valued critics? Who keeps you honest?
Ironically, I think the people who have always kept me the most honest are the young people who work with me. Partly because I've always I'm one of these guys, I think it may come from insecurity. But in every bureau I've ever run, I've always had young people working in, and I've always, and even, no matter if I write a script, I show it to everybody. I'm like advertising. You show this is okay. So I show it to everybody. And I've always found that the young people, often the interns, are the most honest about what they think is good, bad, or indifferent. And they most often pick up indifference. Anybody who's indifferent to what I do gets my attention all the time. I've worked for some very good bosses down through the years. Roone Arledge, aside from infusing our news division with money and energy, was a wonderful one, he's not dead, is a wonderful, wonderful editor who I would never finish a program without going and running it past his perspective. I've worked for some wonderful executive producers who, the secret with me is always to know when to rein me in. You know, because I get so enthusiastic about something, I'm likely to go off the deep end, and so it's very important that I work with strong people. I'm still, I suppose, the high school thing. I'm still always, I love to work up. I'd have made a terrible freelancer. I'd have died on the vine if someone had to go out and all by myself make a living. I've always benefited tremendously from working within a structure. I'm doing the psychobabble. You know.
How much do you feel that the sound bite has contributed to Washington's formulation and implementation of foreign policy, and I guess domestic policy?
Can you do that again, please?
Well, I think the sort of essence of it is, how has the sound bite influenced the policy making in government?
Well, I think, I mean, everybody here knows the answer to this one. The society is just, our sort of attention spans have shrunk. The idea that the best magazine show on the air should be called 60 Minutes says something about our attention span. And the decline of the one-hour documentary in commercial television, at least, says, I think, something else about our attention span, and says a little something about the audience within the television universe. And I think the rise or the increasing symbiosis of the relationship between politicians and television has contributed something to the sound bite culture. If you go, I suppose one of the great benefits of radio and one of the great new benefits of the Internet is that both those mediums will allow people to talk at greater length. I'm not always sure it contributes to. We're criticized a lot in the business about sound bites. And there are always people out there making a living through some, funded by some foundation, measuring how long the sound bites are this year. A sound bite in which someone says "help," it seems to me, is immensely powerful. So if they said "help," please come and help me, not necessarily necessary to extend the time. I don't know what to do about it. We're conscious about it, about how it endangers comprehensibility and how it contributes to a lack of context.
And indeed, it's very odd to be interviewed for a half an hour, and then when you...
Be like this. This has been 3 hours? How long has this been?
We're heading home here, Peter. But, then to find that when you're on the air, there's one phrase that has been extracted from
I suppose the pity in some respects is that people have had to learn to talk in sound bites. And what's even worse, of course, think in sound bites. I have a rule in my shop. You're never allowed, I probably shouldn't tell you this, Orville, because you'll go on longer the next time we interview. I will not allow anybody to put a sound bite on a broadcast which ends up, in other words, in which we cut somebody off in the middle of a phrase in which they clearly had more to say. It drives me crazy. I'm sure it drives you crazy too when somebody's cut off in the middle of a phrase. So people learn to talk in sound bites, and maybe they even learn to think in sound. The most dangerous element is when people think in sound bites.
Where is the line between the public's right to information and the individual's right to privacy? And, this maybe your own life would be instructive here, that you are a public figure. And how is it for you when the press invades your private life?
Well, it's terrible. Again, it has something to do with my upbringing. You find less of that stuff, less prurient material on World News Tonight. I think you probably will in other places, and that's a matter of upbringing, and it's a little bit of having had my own private life invaded, but you can't complain about that if you're invading other people. I think it's a really broad and complicated subject which we won't even begin to do justice to here. I did a program this year in which 3 former Secret Service agents at the White House talked about what it was like to be in John F. Kennedy's White House. And if you look back to the time of the coverage of the Kennedy White House, it's really quite astonishing how much the reporters knew about what went on in the administration, and about which they said nothing. One of America's great editors, Ben Bradley, now retired as executive editor of the Washington Post, kind of knew it all and didn't say anything. And we can't leave Clinton alone. Now, is that simply I think in part it's the passage of time, the changing of the whole culture, the fact that privacy is seen to be less important when it comes to public figures. I find it distasteful sometimes. I thought the Diana phenomenon was almost vulgar, and said so at the time it was going on, but was not able to resist it. And please don't, I didn't resist it. That's, I think, the most important thing. And I now go around arrogantly saying to my friends, well, I told you she'd disappear, which I think she has. I thought the John F. Kennedy experience was, on the one hand, vulgar and at the same time instructional. I said to my employers at the time of the funeral, if we really want to take a stand, let's not cover the funeral, because there's no television access, there's no radio access. They said, well, no. They're very smart. pressures of the marketplace and all that. If they don't get it here, they're going to go somewhere else, and then maybe they'll not come and watch us again. So I took that as instructive. But we're only going to go on, and we're going to come off. We'll go on a little bit at the beginning of the service, and we won't cover the service, and we'll come on at the end. Of course, we did 3.5 hours. But it was one of the best 3.5 hours I ever did, because we managed to gather together a group of young people and older people, some from who talked at great length, 3.5 hours, about what the Kennedys meant to America, all the while this service went in. So we were, on the one hand, desperately prurient, and would have been and very invasive. On the other hand, he was wonderfully instructional and wonderfully cultural and wonderfully historic. It was one of the best 3 hours I ever worked on ever, and learned a great deal from it. So I don't know what, in other words, there's no clear answer about this at any given time.
Let's do one more question. Will the independence and objectivity of the
you realize we run through 3 signers? Can I ask what number you are?
I think there's 2. It's tag team.
If they are having to rest, we have been here too long.
Well,
Can I tell you a silly story about signing?
Please.
I've had a long interest in the hearing impaired and the deaf, and World News Tonight was the first news broadcast in America to be captioned, which I take enormous pride. And so I was asked to give the graduation speech one year at Gallaudet, which is the famous university in Washington, and I said, well, at the very least, and I had a friend, a young woman friend, who was currently a student at Gallaudet, and I was so excited, I decided, I want to watch the look on her face, that I would sign the last paragraph of my commencement address. You have no idea how, this is American Sign Language, you have no idea how hard this is. Unbelievably hard. I practiced for weeks in my office just to say one paragraph. And then, in the last paragraph, I did this when I should have done when I should have done this. And I apparently said something horribly vulgar. The place broke up. I was never invited back again. So, madam, you have my deepest respect, and we will be out of here shortly.
Well, let's do this final question. Will the independence and objectivity of the news media be compromised as ownership of news outlets consolidates into fewer hands?
Unquestionably.
Good thing.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
It's a good answer.
Yes, but it's a bad question in which to end, because I apologize. That's very rude of me. It's a doorway. It's a doorway into a whole new world order of more media in fewer hands. And I don't know the answer to it, except to tell you, as I told you earlier, that Disney has stayed out of my life, except when it comes to economic matters. I said to somebody early today, I try to prevent the young people in my office from watching the Disney stock as it goes up and down, or down, as seems to be the current case with the Disney stock, because I don't want young people working. I'm a real pain in the neck here. I'm a bore on this subject. I don't want people to think that how they cover the news has something to do with the fortunes of their company. I was never brought up that way. And one thing about journalists, we're all brought up to bite the hand that feeds us. God knows why, but it's that badge of pride we wear in the darkest, ugliest places in the world. We know that those creepy people we work for are not as good and as interesting as we are. And it's really true. Journalists don't very often admit this, except to each other. We think we are the most interesting people we know. It's positively embarrassing. But if you have spent... I have never met people to whom I felt closer in my whole life than other journalists under stress. Sidney Schanberg, Pulitzer Prize-winning guy, the Killing Fields, Cambodia. Wonderful journalist, now as an independent, now as a columnist. Almost got me killed once in India because he was behaving like a jerk at some guy who was hopped up on something, who was pointing his gun at us. But I forgave him instantly, just because he was a journalist. I would never forgive anybody else. Something like that. So our masters are our masters. and they will do what they have to do. We will resist them when it's necessary, coddle them when it is appropriate. Hope they don't believe this stuff. And stay out of their way as best we can.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you all very much.